So, Diamond Sutra, and the occasion for we've studied this before in the seminar and other places, but there's a new translation by Red Pine, and a new translation is an occasion to look at a text that you've looked at before, and every time you look at a text that you've looked at before, what do you know? It's different, because life is different, you're different, the world is different. So you don't use up a text forever and ever, you go back to it. And Red Pine brings a lot of freshness and a new spirit to the text, so it's been fun for me to read it. And I hope those of you who are interested will get the book. It's pretty easily available, and take a look at it. One thing that's different about this book that we haven't seen in any of the other translations of the Diamond Sutra is that since Red Pine is a China person, and spent a lot of time in China, reads Chinese, and has spent time in Chinese monasteries, he includes in his commentary, the Diamond Sutra, is a very short book, but this is a fat book. That's because mostly it's commentary to the very short Diamond Sutra, and most of the commentary, or not most of, but a lot of the commentary, is Red Pine quoting from a number of different commentators. So that's kind of interesting, especially Chinese commentators over the generations. So this is a feature of this book that you don't find in other translations that's very worthwhile. And the truth is that this is a very important and interesting aspect of study. I mean, so far in Western study of Buddhism, we barely have good translations of important texts, let alone commentaries on those texts. But in any tradition where you read and study Scripture, there's always a commentarial tradition that goes on for thousands of years, where in every generation people are commenting on what this text means. And so, really the text is actually the text plus the commentarial tradition. So we actually don't have that. In a way, that's great, because we can be very fresh with the text. But in a way, we're missing out on thousands of years of people who have been in conversation. I mean, this text, the Diamond Sutra, like everything we study, is a conversation that goes for hundreds, thousands of years between people who are really concerned about what is our human life. Let's discuss, let's think, let's live through these questions. And so we're losing, It's as if we think the conversation started yesterday with us, but no, it's been going on a long time. And so it's nice to have Red Pine's translation and get a little taste of what that conversation has been. When I've studied scriptures of various traditions and studied the commentaries on those scriptures, and this is just me, I don't know if you would feel the same, but I feel like about 90% of the commentaries are not useful because of differences in time and place and sort of perspective. Even though that's true, it's still very interesting to read them because they give you a sense of how people looked at the text. But that 10% that is useful is often incredibly illuminating and important. And it's worth reading 100% just to find that 10% if you're lucky enough to find it. So I find that also in Red Pines. A lot of the commentaries don't mean that much to me, but every now and then there's something really important that I come across. And another reason why we're reading Diamond Sutra this month is that we spent the last month on the Platform Sutra. And we learn in the Platform Sutra that the Platform Sutra is sort of like the pivotal text of Zen. It's the moment when Zen, which, as we were saying last month, Zen basically is Chinese Buddhism. It's not one of many schools of Chinese Buddhism. It's essentially what the Chinese reading of Buddhism is what Zen is. And the Platform Sutra, the Sixth Ancestor Sutra, is the moment when that Chinese understanding of Buddhism crystallizes. And in that text, the Sixth Ancestor more or less announces that we're basing our reading of Buddhism on the Diamond Sutra. And it's the DiamondSutra, as we know from the story, that turns the sixth ancestor's head around and gets him to take up the study of Buddhism. So that's why we're really interested now to read the DiamondSutra more than before. By the way, another interesting thing about Red Pine's book, and I've never seen any other book that does this. You know, he writes a preface to the translation. That's common. But usually the preface comes at the beginning. I mean, he doesn't put the preface at the beginning. The book has basically 3 parts. A very skinny part, just a few pages long, is his translation of the DiamondSutra. It's only maybe 25 pages long or something like that. And then the second part is his preface to the translation of the DiamondSutra, which is also relatively brief. And then comes the commentary, where he repeats the translation and has extensive comments of his own, plus from all these translators. So it's kind of interesting technique, to write a preface to the book, but not put the prefacing the book, but put it later on in the book. So a few things that I found interesting in his preface. First of all, he mentions that, and this is interesting to me. I don't know how interesting you find it, but he says that he thinks it's entirely possible that the teachings given in the DiamondSutra might actually have been given by the historical Buddha. This is a little startling to hear this, because this is not what scholars or anybody else says. The usual story that we all got, and that all Western Buddhist scholars or modern scholars, Asian scholars say the same, if they're schooled in modern critical scholarship. And maybe this has changed, but as far as I know, the idea is that these teachings, the emptiness teachings, came considerably later than the time of the historical Buddha. That the teachings that we've studied so much, the Pali Canon teachings, are probably the closest to the way the Buddha actually spoke and taught Dharma. But then later, there were other texts and other tendencies, and that this is from the later period. That's what most scholars think. And the reason they think that is because there are no versions of any of these sutras earlier than 300-400 years after the passing of the historical Buddha. So therefore, since we don't have any earlier texts, we assume that the texts were written later. Makes sense, right? But what that story doesn't consider is the fact that even the earliest texts were written down some 100 years after the Buddha's death. In other words, the early teachings were carried orally for quite a while before they were written down. So why couldn't there have been other teachings that were carried orally for a longer period of time and then written down several hundred years later? I mean, actually, logically, that is possible, right? So it's kind of, to me, maybe you don't appreciate this, but to me this is a thrilling idea, Sorry. This is what thrills me, This is a thrilling idea, a daring idea, the idea that the Buddha may have, and the idea is that he may have taught esoteric teachings that he knew people would not be able to necessarily appreciate at first. And that the people who carried those teachings also knew that, and so they thought, well, we're not going to write these down because they're not going to be relevant. So these other things they'll write down, and that's okay, but we won't write these down. And then the time comes a couple of hundred years later when they say, okay, now people can appreciate this, so now we'll write it down. So this is Red Pine's story, and it's a great story. I like this story. And I really never heard this story before, and he tells it with a completely straight face, as if it were absolutely possible. And logically, it is possible. It's really possible. And there's a lot of scholarly work being done on, revising the idea that the Mahayana Buddhism is a later development. And pretty much, I'm convinced by what scholarship I've read that the Mahayana tendencies were there very early on. A more democratic, a more generous version of the teachings was there from the beginning. So now the thing is, and I think why Red Pine comes to this kind of a view, is that he's, as I said, coming from the standpoint of the Chinese tradition. And in China, historically, it is the case that there was this, huge proliferation of texts in India. And they were coming to China pretty much willy-nilly. Somebody went to India, they just happened to stumble into this or that monastery. Somebody said, hey, you got to get this text, this is the best thing, bring this back to China, you must translate this. They grabbed it, they went back to China. Somebody was in another place and the same thing happened and they went back to China. So the Chinese people were getting this very confusing array of Buddhist texts coming into China. And of course they were and they just automatically assumed that all these, because they all said, the Buddha said this and the Buddha said that, so they automatically assumed these are all teachings of the Buddha, but they sound so different, one from the other, and they even sound contradictory. They were even arguing with each other sometimes, and the Chinese were wondering, how do we make sense of this? And so there were various schemes in Chinese Buddhism to explain this. And in other words, a system whereby there was a chronology and a rhyme or reason to this confusion of texts. And Red Pine, in his introduction, quotes, describes one of the many different systems. And so this is interesting. I'll just go through this. It's brief. After the Buddha's awakening, he was so enthusiastic and so sort of cosmic in his awakening that he just sort of blurted out exactly what was on his mind. It took him 3 weeks. And in 3 weeks, he spoke the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is a 1,500 page cosmic sutra, which someday we'll study. It takes years to read through this thing. I did one time a class at Green Gulch. 3 years. It took 3 years. Which is why I haven't wanted to take it up again. But we'll do it someday. It's an amazing text. I mean, it's just, you can't imagine the extravagance of this text. So that's the idea that, first of all, in the beginning, the Buddha just sort of blurted out exactly what he experienced in his awakening. But then everybody was dazed and confused by these teachings. So then the Buddha thought again, and he said, well, this is not working. People are not getting this at all. They think I'm a lunatic. So now I better start from the beginning, and I better set up a framework so that all this could now be understood. So then he started teaching what we've been calling the Pali teachings, the older teachings. And for 12 years he sort of built up a conceptual framework. And then the third stage in Chinese Buddhism they call the Vaipulya Sutras, the extended Mahayana Sutras, because the Pali Sutras are all fairly short and clear and to the point. And then there was an expansion, a kind of poetic expansion of the sutras. And that took 8 years. And then the fourth stage was the Prajnaparamita Sutras, the Diamond Sutra, and a variety of other texts. We read the 8,000-line Prajnaparamita Sutra within this last year, and there are many others. For 22 years, according to this system, the Buddha taught all these texts. So, interestingly, what are considered historically to be the earliest texts are not the earliest texts in this system. They came later. And then the last stage was where the Buddha taught the Lotus Sutra, which is for Far East Asian Buddhism, the culminating text of all of Buddhism. And we've read that one in the seminar as well. And all of it leads up to the completion, which is the Lotus Sutra. So anyway, that's one of the systems. The third one was the Vaipulya Sutras, the extended Mahayana Sutras, which are like the Vimalakirti Sutra. And there's actually a lot of long Mahayana Sutras that have never been translated into English. But there was a huge outpouring of them. So
The Malakirti Sutra was the first of that series?
I don't know if it was the first. What they said about that, it was part of that. Yeah, as far as I know. Yeah. So anyway, this was the Chinese system. That has almost nothing to do with what modern scholarship finds. But you have to remember too that modern scholarship is based on texts that people happen to find, and obviously most of the texts were lost. So it's like archaeology. You dig stuff up and you find something out and you make up a story, but then later on you dig something else up and you find out, whoa, that wasn't right. We found something else. So modern scholarship, its methodologies are sound, but it's based on scanty evidence. Anyway, in the preface, Red Pine says that he tried to understand the sutra for a long time and never could until he found the Sanskrit text. And then when he found the Sanskrit text, that helped him to understand. And then he says this amazing thing, which I think we ought to keep in mind as we read the sutra. He says on page 34 of his introduction, it turns out that the sutra is not about emptiness. Or at least, it is an emptiness that distinguishes this sutra. It's about bodies, he says. It's about bodies. Beginning with the Buddha's body and ending with the body of every noble son or daughter who practices this teaching. And he doesn't explain. So I'm suggesting we keep that in mind as we read the sutra. If this is what does this mean? That this sutra is about my body and your body and the Buddha's body. Very provocative statement. So, the sutra itself is called the Vajrachedika Prajna Paramita Sutra. We all know what a sutra is. It's the name for Indian scriptures, not just Buddhist scriptures, but all Indian scriptures were called sutras, which means sayings that are strung together. Prajna, paramita. Prajna, we know, means wisdom. And the wisdom that specifically, not sort of general wisdom, practical wisdom, but specifically the wisdom that sees the empty nature of reality. Paramita means usually translated as perfection. So prajna paramita, the perfection of wisdom. But it's in the context of the Mahayana practice of the 6 perfections: generosity, morality, energy, patience, meditation, and wisdom as the 6th. But in the Prajna Paramita literature, the other 5 are subsumed under wisdom. It's as if wisdom is the essence of all of the paramitas. In other words, the whole of practice becomes almost collapsed into the idea of cognizing emptiness. And paramita also means to go beyond, to reach the other shore, to enter into a whole new paradigm. So prajna paramita is often translated as wisdom beyond wisdom. Wisdom gone beyond any conventional notion of wisdom. Wisdom that can't be defined or limited in any way. So the object of this wisdom is, as I said, emptiness. But that's a funny thing to say because emptiness could never be an object because it's not a thing. It isn't anything, emptiness. It's empty. So it can't be grasped or perceived. And I really like what Jeff said a few weeks ago. I've quoted since then a couple times, that emptiness is a double negative. Undoing It's an undoing. It's not a something. It's an undoing. It's an untying of the knot of our conceptual framework, which is making such a mess of our lives and our worlds in small and large ways. And so emptiness, to untie that knot, is a really crucial thing. So emptiness basically is an untying and undoing. It's a pointing to a problem, but not really offering a solution, because any solution that was not empty would just lead to more problems. So emptiness teachings are radical in that they only show how the knots bind us. They don't, and they untie the knots, but they don't offer something graspable to believe in or make use of. So emptiness is a very empty function. It's not anything at all. Emptiness is empty of anything. Vajra is a diamond, which is the hardest substance in the world. Nothing can smash a diamond, but a diamond can smash even the hardest substance. So the indestructible cutting through, and Chedika means cutting, diamond cutter, diamond cutting, Prajnaparamita Sutra. In Tantric Buddhism, Vajra means diamond, and it also means thunderbolt. Like a thunderbolt crashes in the sky and in that instant illuminates the whole of the sky. It's sort of the same idea of a diamond that cuts through. Just the same way that emptiness cuts through our knots and our confusions. All of a sudden, very much in the way that the sixth ancestor was talking about it when we read the Platform Sutra last month. A sudden, direct cutting through our confusion, not a complicated step-by-step process, but a direct cutting through by an indestructible, piercing element. So that's the title. So we'll go begin reading the sutra. And it begins like this. It's divided into 32, 33 chapters, something like that. And the chapters are short, maybe half a page. So this is how it begins. Like all sutras, thus have I heard. Presumably Ananda speaking. Thus have I heard. Once the Bhagavan was dwelling near Shravasti at Anathapindika garden in Jeta forest, together with the full assembly of 1,250 bhikshus and a great many fearless bodhisattvas. So that's the beginning of the sutra. As all sutras, it begins with just sort of setting the scene. So, like all commentaries, the traditional commentaries always take every word. That's why commentaries are so thick like this, because they don't gloss over. They don't let you forget a single word, and they often derive meanings from very innocent-looking words that are surprising. So they're long commentaries to the first word of the sutra. Thus have I heard. Long commentaries on this, and. Red Pine quotes one commentary by a man named Chang Wu-nung, who turns out to be a 20th century layman, Chinese layman. And the word thus, usually in Zen, means just this. In other words, what's starkly there. Like when we sit and we return to just presence, sort of everything falling away, and there's just the feeling of being alive, just bare presence. Well, that's usually what the word thus is taken to mean, the bare presence of something. But this commentator says, when people believe something, they say it is thus. So the word thus has to do with belief. Thus have I heard. I heard this and I believe it. So it stands for a faithful, receptive listening. And it's interesting that the sutra begins with this, because it's quite not the way we would think of it. In Western Buddhism, our sort of historical roots for Buddhism begin with the idea of Buddhism as a sort of something very different from Christianity, Judaism. Buddhism is a rational antidote to faith and belief, which is irrational, and people get, confused by their belief, but this is something else. And most Western Buddhists consider, belief and faith to be negative aspects of religious practice. And the Kalama Sutra is often quoted, where the Buddha says, don't believe something just because you hear it, don't ever take it on faith, test it with your own experience. This is quoted constantly in Western Buddhism to tell you that this is something different. So it's kind of surprising that this commentator would tell you that the sutra here begins with faith. But when you think about it, you really can't make use of something if you don't believe it, at least provisionally. I mean, if you hear something and you don't believe it, it goes in one ear and out the other. You're not going to make use of it. So a certain amount of faith or belief is actually necessary when it comes to spiritual practice. And certainly a Buddhist faith is different from Christian faith. Faith in a savior, faith in a particular individual maybe, although Christianity is a lot more complicated than that, of course. Here it's faith in Buddha nature, faith in the nature of our lives, faith in what our life could be, faith in the unlimited nature of consciousness, something like that. So maybe there's a kind of preliminary faith that you bring in the beginning, and then like the Kalama Sutra, you practice, you continue, and then somehow this faith is verified by your own experiences, by your own reflections. But we've talked also about the idea that experience, the notion of experience, is also problematic too, because if the basis of any real spiritual practice is some sense of trust or faith in something beyond the limited self, then this, whatever it is, can't be reduced to an experience that the limited self has, right? If we're trying to practice in a larger space than ourselves, recognizing the limitations of ourselves, then how is the smallness of ourself going to contain an experience that expresses that? So that's true, but at the same time, we do have a feeling of knowing that something is so. Maybe we have some provisional faith and confidence in the beginning, just enough anyway, to make our own personal investigations. But then we don't stick with it unless we feel for ourselves, yes, I see in my own living something is different. Something is happening. And so now I listen with even more interest than in the beginning, because I know there's a value to this for my living. But it really does come down to a kind of faith or belief. So maybe we shouldn't be so allergic to those words and those concepts as we have been. Mm-hmm.
But he's saying at the beginning, after having heard it all. So he's saying, thus have I heard.
Oh, yes, that's a point. Yeah, he's heard the whole sutra. when he says thus.
So now he's convinced.
Right. Yeah, that's true. So, going on. Well, maybe just to say a word about the Bhagavan is a name for the Buddha, one of many names of the Buddha. The Blessed One, the one who is blessed and who brings blessings. And he was dwelling near Shravasti, which was a big city, in a grove, a garden outside the city, with a full assembly of monks. It doesn't mention nuns, although later it does, and a great many fearless bodhisattvas. So this tells you that the Buddha's lifestyle was not to live like a hermit far away from everybody. He lived near town, pretty much. That was the usual routine. Live near town, in a quiet grove outside of town, and then go into town, as we'll find in the next paragraph, for begging for alms and for mingling with people in the town. And Anathapindika's garden, I think you all know about Anathapindika's garden. It was given by the Buddha. Anathapindika saw this grove, wanted to buy it, and the prince Jada said, well, I'll sell it to you if you cover it with gold, thinking that this was an absurd thing. But he actually did. He covered it with gold. And so Jada sold it to him because he couldn't go back on his word, and then also gave some extra land. So that was the Jada's Grove in Anathapindika's park, which is where the Buddha spent a lot of time. So there were a modest number of bhikshus in attendance and many fearless spiritual heroes, bodhisattvas. So one day before noon, the Bhagavan put on his patched robe and picked up his bowl and entered the capital of Shravasti for offerings. After begging for food in the city and eating his meal of rice, he returned from his daily round in the afternoon, put his robe and bowl away, washed his feet, and sat down on the appointed seat. After crossing his legs and adjusting his body, he turned his awareness to what was before him. So this is all the Buddha preparing. Kind of like it's a little bit of a little vignette, of the Buddha's daily routine. It doesn't say so, but probably he got up early and meditated in the morning. It does seem that the Buddha, as you read these texts, that he didn't have a very demanding and taxing lifestyle. He wasn't, I guess he didn't, he got up when he felt like it. But he probably went to bed early, so he probably got up pretty early. But not, he didn't have somebody running around with a wake-up bell or anything like that. He probably just got up when he felt like it, and probably the first thing he felt like doing is meditating, as anybody would. So then he spent some time meditating, and then he probably, sort of rested and hung around for a while, and then before noon he got himself ready. He put on his robe and went out begging because he was hungry, because there was no food there. It was, they didn't have any food. They didn't have a kitchen or storehouse. So when you got hungry, you had to go out and beg for some food. So it was a pretty simple, easygoing life. So he put on his patched robe and picked up his bowl and entered the capital of Shravasti for offerings. So the robe and the bowl are the only possessions that a monastic has. So he put on his robe and he picked up his bowl and off he went. And as you remember from the 6th Ancestor Sutra, the robe and the bowl became eventually kind of archetypes symbolizing the power of the teachings. So the robe and the bowl were given, to the successor and so forth. But in the beginning, it was a very simple thing. It was just what you needed, and all you needed, a minimum requirement for daily life. And if you read, sort of contemporary studies of the Buddha's life, they often say that at the time of the Buddha was a time of great change in India and around the world. It was a time when cities became large, and there was a level of sort of self-consciousness and individuality and a kind of commerce and communication that had not existed previously, that it was a radically sort of paradigm shift era, and that the Buddha's teaching was in response to that. So that, all over the world, previous to this period, most religions were animistic, land-based. They were about making sacrifices on behalf of the community. They weren't about the salvation of the individual and about the pain of isolation as individuals, which we have to our own time. So in a way, the Buddhist time was the beginning of a sort of historical trajectory that still exists, and has maybe gotten worse in terms of the painfulness of individual alienation. But it already existed in the Buddhist time, and the Buddhist teaching was in response to that, which is why, it says he lives near a city, and he's constantly in dialogue with people in the city. He's not, although he sometimes is in villages and so on, talking to village people, I think that the Buddha's whole teaching and whole sort of sense of life wouldn't exist in the same way without proximity to cities and all that came from the life of that time. And we learn from Red Pine's commentary about the fact that the monastics owned more than one robe. There was the robe that this kind of rakusu has, we always say in the ceremony, it has 5 panels. It's made of 5 panels that are, sewn together. Patch robe. So the robe is patches are cut out and then sewn together. And so the original robe that the Buddha wore was a 5-jo robe, which was like the regular clothes, and then over the 5-jo robe was worn a 7-panel robe, which is like the kesa that priests wear. And then when he went into the more formal occasions, he would wear a 9-panel robe. So he had several robes. And so when he comes back from begging, it says here, he came back, he ate his food in the afternoon. He put his robe and bowl away. That doesn't mean he was naked. It means that he put the formal robe that he was wearing to be in the city away. And he put the bowl away. And he probably put on this 7-jo robe that he wore around camp. Then he washed his feet, and he sat down on the seat, crossed his legs, adjusted his body, turned his awareness to what was before him. So there's a sense of quiet here and care. And this word fixed his attention on what was before him. It's a technical word, in the Sutra on Mindfulness, there's 4 foundations of mindfulness. Mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of sensations, mindfulness of thoughts, and mindfulness of reality, constituents of reality. These are focused awarenesses. But this is an awareness where there's just awareness of whatever's in front of you. So in other words, you're not focusing on the breath or on the body or something specifically, but there's a sense of, an open sense of awareness to what's in front of you. It's a kind of you could say a 5th foundation of mindfulness, maybe the graduate school of mindfulness. Not to be mindful, cultivating mindfulness, but having cultivated mindfulness to maintain mindfulness to whatever appears in front of you. And in a way, Zen mindfulness is very much like this. It doesn't necessarily at all times have a particular technical focus, but it's just a presence with whatever is arising. So that's how the Buddha was organizing his mind. And here is where I found a couple of commentaries that I thought were really interesting and useful, and I'll read them for you. They appear on page 52. Chung Wei Nung, the same person we mentioned before, says, and he's a 20th century commentator, by the way. Interesting, yeah, 20th century commentator. So he says, unfortunate suffering beings, the rich as well as the poor, spend their lives working for food and clothes. Like us, right? No matter what kind of job they do, they all work for food. They get up in the morning and they hurry into the city to work. Working for food is important. But when your work is done, you should return to your own place. When your work is done, you should return to your own place. The problem with most people is that for the sake of food and clothes, they run around like beggars and eventually forget who they are and no longer return to their own place. So this happens, right? You lose your home. You lose your place. It's like, where was I? I lost my place, you know. And so he's saying, like the Buddha, you know, who goes out and comes back and settles himself, we need to do the same. We do need to go out and earn our food, but we should come back and find our place. When your work is done, don't involve yourself in what doesn't concern you. Thus, the Buddha sits down and focuses on the thought before him. And Sufa, who I think is in the 18th century, the Buddha puts on his robe and takes up his bowl to uphold the precepts of morality. So he says, taking up the robe and the bowl stands for the precepts of morality, proper conduct. He washes his feet and takes his seat to enter meditation. Thus does morality give birth to meditation, and meditation to wisdom. Also, by entering the city with his robe and bowl, he goes from the noumenal into the phenomenal. In other words, he leaves the absolute realm of his quiet life and enters into the worry and flurry and the hubbub of the city. So he does that when he goes out, but when he comes back and washes his feet, he goes from the phenomenal into the noumenal. He returns to the absolute. It is only by remaining unattached to the noumenal as well as the phenomenal that undifferentiated wisdom can be realized. So I thought those were really nice commentaries. And I think completely relevant to us, because we need to learn how to jump into the world. And, I think we have to take that on. And here, it's a practice for the Buddha to go into town. It's practical. He needs food just like we need food. But for him, it was a ritual and a practice that he welcomed, that he sought out. He probably could have gotten somebody to set him up with a bunch of food, and he wouldn't have to go in there and do that. But he seemed to feel like it was a good idea for him to go in every day and beg for his food. And he actually made a monastic rule that you couldn't store up food. You had to go in and do that. So maybe for us, when we go through the process, which is sometimes difficult and painful and distracting, of entering the world to work for our food, maybe we realize this is a practice, the practice of the phenomenal world. But we also have to learn how to put those things down when we come home and find our real place. Sometimes we have to know what it's like to turn our attention to something that's beyond ourself and our needs. And then there's other times when we have to take care of ourself and our needs and brush shoulders with everybody else. And then the second commentary tells us that we shouldn't have a hierarchy, thinking one is more important than the other, or one is even different from the other. Not to cling to either one. That's the wisdom. That's where wisdom comes from, going the back and forth. So this is really important for us, because this is what we do. We go back and forth. And we we practice being quiet, we practice studying Dharma, we go out into the world and completely forget about it and do our lives. And so it's good for us. And we need to see the non-difference between these two and the non-clinging to either one of them. So then some of the bhikshus came up to where the Bhagavan was sitting, and they touched their heads to his feet. They walked around him to the right 3 times, and they sat down on one side, because it's clear that the Buddha is about to, or maybe he might say something. So they're ready to listen. And this is this sort of polite, ritualistic way of listening, to circumambulate the Buddha 3 times, to sit down and be receptive. And then, second chapter. On this occasion, the Venerable Subhuti was also present in the assembly. Rising from his seat, he uncovered one shoulder and touched his right knee to the ground. He kneeled, in other words, on his right knee. He pressed his palms together, and bowing to the Buddha, he got ready to ask a question. So that's the polite, ritualistic way of asking a question. That's how you did it in the days of the Buddha. It's interesting that they give you these details, exactly how people would ask. And here's his question, at least the beginning of it. It is rare, Bhagavan, most rare, indeed, Sugata, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, blesses fearless bodhisattvas with the best of his blessings. And it is rare, Bhagavan, how the Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, entrusts fearless bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts. So, first of all, the speaker in the sutra is Subhuti, and we've noticed Subhuti appearing before in Prajna Sutras. He sort of stands in contrast to Shariputra, who also appears in Prajna Sutras as the person who stands for the careful monastic practice of cultivating positive dharmas and purity, and letting go of impurity and negative dharmas. Subhuti is not known for that practice. Subhuti's practice is more like the Vajracchedika, cutting through practice of seeing the empty nature of everything, in which case, as we learned last month in the 6th Ancestor Sutra, you don't need to wipe anything clean, because everything is empty anyway. There's nothing there to clean. So that's Subhuti. And Subhuti's, the name either means born from emptiness, depending on what kind of etymology you follow, born from emptiness, or it might mean auspicious sign, or auspicious appearance. And the story is told of Subhuti that when Subhuti was about to be born, he was from a wealthy family. When he was about to be born, all of a sudden all the gold and silver in the household disappeared, like just vanished. So that's why he was called born from emptiness. But then after he was born, it all reappeared. So then he was called auspicious sign, auspicious sight, because it all came back again. So maybe it's a conflation of these two things. Anyway, that's Subhuti. And then there are all these names in this passage for the Buddha. Sugata, the one who is well gone, beyond this mundane world. The Arahan, the Arhat, free from passions. The Tathagata, the one who thus comes and thus goes, or as we learn tonight, the Tathagata, Tata, the Tata part of the word Tathagata means thus, and as we learn tonight, thus means, might stand for belief, faith. So the Buddha is the one who inspires faith. And then isn't it something? Subhuti says, the way the Buddha blesses with great blessings and entrusts with great trust the bodhisattvas, who Red Pine interprets as spiritual heroes, fearless spiritual heroes. So this blessing and this entrustment we learn here is something that is freely and wonderfully given to us by the Buddha. In the beginning, before anything ever happens, we're given this. And we learned last month in the Sixth Ancestor Sutra all about Buddha nature and how important, that the whole teaching of Zen and of the Six Ancestors is based on confidence in our fundamental true nature. And so here we're finding that this fundamental true nature is a matter of blessings, virtue in a sense, that we receive, and entrustment that we receive. It's a kind of a beautiful thing that we're blessed and we're entrusted as a human birthright. This is our human birthright, is to be blessed and entrusted. It's a wonderful thing to be trusted, isn't it? I mean, in the world at large, people don't trust one another. I mean, not that everybody's going around completely paranoid, but partly paranoid, I think it would be accurate to say. We all go around partly paranoid. That's why we have like laws and rules and regulations and everything, because you can't trust anybody, and you got to make sure. And there are penalties in case people don't follow the laws, and they usually don't, but we can evoke those penalties, and we have to watch each other, So I think we all have the experience of, and if we're trusted, we're not trusted that far. It's easy to step outside the bounds of our trust, right? How much people trust us, right? So I mean, the feeling of being really trusted, to trust another, and to be really trusted at that level of full trustworthiness. This is really, I mean, we don't think about it, but this is really something unusual, and something really powerful, powerfully healing, and powerfully transformative, to feel trusted, that we are really trusted, and that we are trustworthy. We could trust ourselves, because I think we don't trust ourselves either, because as a reflection of all this wariness in the world at large. So this is our birthright, to be greatly blessed in a very special way, in a very precious way, greatly blessed and greatly trusted. And isn't this a wonderful thing? Subhuti. He begins this question, in other words, I know this already, Buddha. I understand that we all have this great blessing, and we have this great trust. And isn't it wonderful? Isn't it rare? And then he says, even so. So despite this, I mean, I know this, but even so, I have a question. Even so, it feels like there's something I have to do. Somehow, I don't feel like I can just rest and be peaceful with my being blessed, my being trusted. There's something I have to do. And I think we can understand this. We all feel that too, right? There's something we have to do. So help me out, Buddha, to figure out what it is I have to do. And so here's the way he puts this question. Even so, Bhagavan, if a noble son or daughter should set forth on the bodhisattva path, so if we want to set forth, how should we stand? How should we walk? How should we control our thoughts? And let's not make too much of the word control here. I think what it means is what kind of attitude, what kind of spirit, what kind of cultivation of heart and mind should we practice? So even though I know, that I'm blessed, and even though I know that I'm trusted, still it feels like I have to set forth on a journey. So how am I going to do that? How do I stand? And it's very specific, how do I stand? How do I walk? How do I work with my mind? And the Buddha answers. Well said, Subhuti. Well said. So it is, Subhuti. It is as you say. The Tathagata blesses fearless bodhisattvas with the best of blessings, and entrusts fearless bodhisattvas with the greatest of trusts, you should therefore truly listen to what I'm about to tell you, because you already have these blessings and you already have this trust. That's why you should listen. Not because you're a wreck and you really need to straighten out, but exactly because you have these blessings and you have this trust. That's why your listening now is so important. So please listen. Listen and consider this well. So first listen to it, and then reflect on it for yourself and test it out for yourself. And I will tell you how those who set forth on the bodhisattva path should stand, how they should walk, and how they should control their thoughts. And the Venerable Subhuti answered, "May it be so, Bhagavan," and he gave his full attention. And that's the end of chapter 2. What a cliffhanger. The Buddha doesn't say what it is until chapter 3. So let's do chapter 3. So, the Buddha said to him, "Subhuti, those who would now set forth on the bodhisattva path should thus give birth to this thought." And here's the thought. So he's not telling him how bodhisattvas should set forth, how they should stand, how they should walk. I mean, these are the kinds of instructions that a careful monastic would want to hear. How do we practice precisely in the detail of it? Instead, the Buddha responds by saying, this is the way you should think about it. This is the attitude that you should have. If you have this attitude, the rest of it is easy. So here's the attitude. You should think like this. However many beings there are, in whatever realms of being might exist, whether they are born from an egg, or born from a womb, born from water, born from air, whether they have form or no form, some kind of like non-physical beings, whether they have perception or no perception, or neither perception nor no perception. I think this means like any kind of being that there could possibly be, in any kind of realm, born from any possible way. So in whatever conceivable realm of being one might conceive of beings, in the realm of complete nirvana, I shall liberate them all. That's how you should think. You should think all beings. A little while ago we were meditating on all beings in the web of being. Right? All those beings, we should think, I myself personally am going to liberate all those beings. I'm going to bring them to nirvana, to peacefulness, to happiness, to well-being, to safety. I'm going to do that. That's the way, that's the spirit. If you have that spirit, that's the answer to your question, is to cultivate that spirit. And then it says, and though I thus liberate countless beings, not a single being is liberated. So you should think like that. You should think, I'm going to liberate all these beings, and though I do that, not a single being is liberated. And why not? Subhuti, a bodhisattva who creates the perception of a being cannot be called a bodhisattva. And why not? Subhuti, no one can be called a bodhisattva who creates the perception of a self, or who creates the perception of a being, a life, or a soul. So the Buddha, in other words, is answering him, look, Subhuti, you're already blessed. You're already fully possessed of trustworthiness. You don't have to improve. You just need to remember your love for all beings and your great desire to help them. So in other words, it's not a job of fixing or improving. It's a very positive job of cultivating an inspiration, giving birth to a thought, he says. The thought of awakening for the benefit of others. And this is the defining quality of a bodhisattva. So this is a sutra. So all the teachings, now this is the most important moment in the sutra in a way. This is telling you that all the teachings that are going to follow from the sutra are in support of our being bodhisattvas and giving birth to this thought of awakening. Just like a conversion thought, boom, you have a thought and you're born again as a bodhisattva with this spirit. You're all about benefiting others. And, it's sort of, you read it and you think, wow, but how are you supposed to make that happen? How do you give birth to a thought? I mean, we sort of know how to give birth to a human being, but how do you give birth to a thought, How do you make a thought happen? And in different Mahayana sutras and texts, there are, really elaborate procedures. I mean, the idea is that you can't make that thought happen. You can't produce it, but you can lay the groundwork. You can do a whole lot of stuff to sort of make it more likely. Like the practice we did this evening. If you have an active practice of cultivating, goodness and well-being for others as an active cultivation, eventually it's possible that you might actually feel that fully. And we studied, last time we studied the Shantideva's Bodhisattva Charyavatara, we read in there the whole range of practices that existed in Indian Buddhism, making offerings, doing prostrations, performing rituals and ceremonies, all of which were designed to condition the mind in the direction of giving birth to this thought. So you can imagine, what could be done. All kinds of spiritual exercises and so on. Not the least of which is just sitting in silence. I think if you sit in silence long enough, you will have this spirit of wanting to benefit others or realizing that you're non-separate from others. So it's that spirit that defines a bodhisattva. And as I say, it's essentially an altruistic spirit. I will liberate all beings from suffering. And have you ever heard that idea before? Yeah, because we chant that at the end of every seminar. Beings are numberless. I vow to save them. This is exactly the same thing. This is the same thing. This is the bodhisattva vow. This is the bodhicitta, to have that thought. So when we chant that chant, we're practicing. We're trying to condition our mind in that direction. And maybe tonight when we chant that line, we can all think, yeah, I'm serious about that. I really want to try to do that. I'm going to do that, for sure. But then, of course, it says, but even though you liberate all these beings, no beings are liberated. Why? Because bodhisattvas don't think in terms of beings, selves, lives, souls. Now this sounds a little bit like some mind-bending paradox. Maybe it makes you confused, or maybe it's a joke or a trick or something. It brings a smile to the lips. We're going to save all these beings, and ha-ha, no being at all will be saved. And this doesn't mean that there are no beings, or that nothing exists. It just means that those who are bodhisattvas do not have a notion or a conception or a perception or a definition of a separate bunch of atomized selves or beings or souls, as we practice tonight in our meditation. There's nobody who isn't connected in this web. What exists is the web. There's nobody who's not connected in that web of connection. So to say there's no notion of a self, of being a soul, a person, and so on, is to say that bodhisattvas don't see any atomized beings outside that web of connection. they see always every being implicated in this web of connection. And so, therefore, every being is constantly being saved along with every other being. And no being is being saved because there aren't any separate beings and there isn't any saving outside this web of connection. The web of connection is the saving already. So this little funny joke or paradox is a profound, the most profound teaching of the sutra and of all of Buddhism, really. And we could discuss it for the duration of the seminar, however many years more beyond today it lasts. And actually we have been discussing it for the last 8 or 10 years anyway. I think our practice actually begins, when it really starts, is when it dawns on us that there is no way that we could actually do spiritual practice by ourselves, for ourselves. And all of us come in the beginning with the opposite perspective. We're going to do practice, and we're doing it in the hopes that it's going to help us somehow. And of course it does help us. But the way it helps us is by liberating us from the tremendous burden of ourselves and the crushing weight of our separate lives. The heavy, alienating experience of being apart and needing to be fixed, needing to be purified, needing to be improved. When we feel like it helps us, we feel like it helps us because that burden is lifted from us. We realize that we're not the person that we thought we were that needed the fixing. And very quickly, whether these, it dawns on us in this language or in this conception or not, it does dawn on us that we are practicing for and with others. That our practice, when it's effective, is effective because it's taking place in a wider sphere, a wider context than the one that we have narrowly defined for ourselves coming into the practice. And when I can practice with that open feeling, with that joyful feeling of caring for others and concern for others and benefiting others, and I don't mean running around trying to fix everybody else, I might as well fix myself, I mean a loving spirit and a concern for others who are already all right the way they are, When I have that feeling, then my own burdens are much lifted from me. And here, it's not only practicing for others, but very specifically for infinite others. Not just for lots of people, but for infinite others. To liberate all others without exception. To lead all others without exception to peace and happiness. This puts practice in the category of an endless, impossible, joyful path. Joyful because endless and impossible. So always complete at any moment, right? That's how it works. That which is never to be completed is therefore, by virtue of that, always complete and incomplete in every moment, on every occasion, so that there's peace at every step of the way. The sort of job that you plan on completing is a little bit burdensome. I'm halfway there, 3/4 of the way there. I'm almost there, This is a big burden. This is like, no way. I'm all the way there before I start. I'm at the end before I begin. Every step of the way is the beginning and the end. So we can take delight in the vastness of this project. I always think, the human imagination is literally without limit. The planet is limited. We're finding out. The planet is limited. There's only so much air. There's only so much good atmosphere. There's only so much earth. There's only so many trees. There's only so much fossil fuel, there's only so much carbon dioxide, but the human imagination is without limit. There is no limit. And so therefore, the only thing that will satisfy us is a literally limitless task that matches the limitlessness of our souls. And as long as we're looking for the accomplishment of a limited task, we're always going to find some unhappiness, because why can't we finish this task? Why are we so far behind? Or now that we finished it, now what do we do? Got to get another task. But a limitless task brings delight and joy to the human soul. The vastness and the endlessness of this project is what we need. So endlessness, vastness evokes the idea of boundarylessness, no bounds, no self, no others, no time, no space, no limits. So how would we perceive, a self or a soul or a person? In Buddhist analysis of perception, in Kanza, I checked with Kanza, he doesn't use the word perception here, he uses the word notion. No notion of a self, no notion of a person, and so on. And both translations are right, because in Buddhist analysis of perception, all perception depends on notions. All perception is based on conceptions. And conceptions flow from distinction and separation and division. So even though our perceptual apparatus and our brains are set up so that we will see the world piecemeal, we come to understand through our practice that seeing all the way through this piecemeal perception, we see the chartless and the boundless bodhicitta, the boundless, chartless, actual nature of things. And we feel an expansive and boundless love for sentient beings. And we know, oh yes, I'm a human being, so naturally my perceptions are going to be limited in this way. And they're going to be bound by my notions. It can't be otherwise. This is how my brain is. This is how my language is. This is how I'm set up. But I'm not fooled by this. I know that through and beyond this limited notion is boundlessness and limitlessness. So I know the nature of my limited notions and perceptions. I know that it's convention, it's physical limitation, and it means I don't have to cling to that perceptual notion-based life that it looks like I'm living.